So, spiritualism and Victorian séance. It was never really as simple as just grabbing a table, turning off the lights and shouting into the darkness. Spiritualism grew from the age of new discoveries. After electricity, evolution and emancipation, why shouldn't the Western world kick down the doors of eternity and contact the dead from the comfort of our own homes? God was favouring the 19th century, sending blessings, developments, and spiritual messengers, at least for those who believed. Now, spiritualism was not a cult, nor was it a singular movement. It was a fractured new religion, growing from established beliefs across a great swathe of denominations. Some churches accepted spiritualism as further proof of the validity of Christ's resurrection and the immortality of the soul. Others, less so. After medium Daniel Douglas Hume's visit to Rome, that's the chap who's depicted on the slide playing an accordion within a cage, as you do, he was personally expelled by the Pope, who believed that the tricks of his table turning were actually as a result of demonic intervention. Now, spiritualism at its peak was full of sex, drugs, and more orifices than you can shake a Ouija board at. Sorry, Rachel. It brought together level-headed people with Martian kings, ancient pirate spirit guides, and undead artists, all for good measure. But the event that really set the spiritualist movement ablaze happened in 1848 in a small farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, with two young girls. The Foxes were a normal American God-fearing family. Supposedly, their house had been haunted for years, and neighbours were sure that there had been violent murders the years before, and that the spirit of the victim lived on within the residence. However, it wasn't until 1848 that the youngest sisters, Kate and Margaret, professed some truly astonishing claims. That March, the family became troubled by mysterious sounds. These were bangings, knocks, and rumbles so loud that it sounded like someone was moving furniture about. The family couldn't make head nor tail of it. The youngest girls at the time were 11 and 14, so they could hardly be throwing wardrobes about, could they? The noises were constant. The family were at breaking point. Then on March 31st, Kate Fox challenged the maker of the noise. She identified it as a spirit and said, "Can you respond to the clicks of my fingers?" It did. Could it knock out the ages of all the Fox siblings? Yes, with swift accuracy. Soon a code between the living and the dead was established, and in this new system, raps could communicate yes or no, or letters of the alphabet. The line between the living and the dead was blurred at last. The girls named the spirit, quite curiously, Mr. Splitfoot, which was an old nickname for the devil. Now, on the 14th of October, 1849, they gave their first public demonstration at Rochester Town Hall. This was the tip of the iceberg. Soon the girls filled enormous halls across the country with their demonstrations, and demonstrations became séances for enormous amounts of people who, rather than wanting to contact the dead, initially just wanted insight into the stocks and shares market. But over time, their séances and raps became known as infallible proof of life after death and communication with the other side. And this religious significance was enormous. At their peak, Kate, Margaret, and their older sister Leah were unimaginably wealthy, and they would have died in wealth too, were it not for the allure of drink, extravagant living, and some very public admissions of fraud. Out of financial need, frustration, or disillusionment at what they created, the sisters gradually spoke out. Kate Fox called spiritualism one of the greatest curses the world has ever known. And the initial thuds from within the house were revealed as being little more than the sounds of an apple on a string. Margaret explained in 1888 that when we went to bed at night, we used to tie an apple to a string and move the string up and down, causing the apple to bump on the floor. Or we would drop the apple on the floor, making a strange noise every time it would rebound. Mother did not understand it and did not suspect us as being capable of a trick because we were so young. And the latter knocks and snaps were from, rather pleasantly, cracking their toe joints. Sometimes their raps were so loud that they echoed through a room, but they could never be heard if the girls' feet were placed on a cushion. Well, Margaret and Kate later denounced spiritualism and all they had created, but it was too late. The ball was already rolling. Once news of the Fox sisters and enterprising mesmerists reached the UK, spiritualism spread like wildfire. Periodicals and study groups emerged, as did associated bodies poised to investigate. Beliefs similarly evolved. Spirits were not only real, but could offer advice, useful knowledge, and provide information on the nature of God and heaven. Many mediums began to take up spirit guides too, commonly at this time the spirits of long-dead men, and traditionally from the Indian subcontinent or from Native American tribes, naturally with that tried and tested Victorian racism and inaccuracy. Saying that, many American mediums were politically active for fighting for Native American rights. So the Native American spirit guide, Black Hawk, has since been the central focus of many African American spiritualist groups. Now, we think of spiritualism in the Victorian era as all séance and darkened rooms, but most of its early popularity was garnered through public lectures. Now, these lectures were conducted by trance mediums, individuals who would go on stage, seemingly enter a trance to make contact with the spirit world or their personal spirit guide. They would then generally present a improvised lecture via their spirit contact. Other variations included channeling old philosophers or the spirits of long-dead family members. The mediums that were most popular in kind of the high point of Victorian spiritualism were people such as Axa Sprague, whose rheumatic fever was cured quite generously by spirits, Pascal Randolph, who was a mixed-race man and abolitionist, and Cora L.V. Scott. Cora was the Britney Spears of the day. She was an absolute superstar of the trance lecture scene, and she packed out concert halls across the Western world with her lectures. Cora also stayed with spiritualism for the rest of her life, never denouncing it. And she even helped form the National Spiritualists Association in America. As for Cora's lectures, while some of her supporters called them inspiring and wondrous, there are also quite a few newspaper reports remaining today that cite them as little more than utter drivel, making not an ounce of sense. But spiritualist séance, it took up so many different forms, but was primarily the realm of the private home, not the hall. Séance is a broad term. It originates from the Old French for session or sit, and it covers the simple hand-holding vocal, is there anybody there, right through to Ouija board use again, automatic writing, cabinet use, and table tipping, the old favourite. But here's kind of an overview of the most popular forms. So we have basic leader-assisted séance. This is a type of thing that you see on TV today quite a lot with paranormal TV shows, whereby there is one medium and a group of gathered sitters. Traditionally in Victorian spiritualism, these would be split evenly into male and female sitters. The sitters may ask for information from the medium, who may enter a trance, or the medium may give out information and wisdom messages as they see fit. Now, many of these mediums at the time professed to have no memory at all of the messages that they channeled, and so they worked with a scribe of sorts to record events. Table turning, or table tipping, was one of the first forms of séance to be really popular in Britain. Many invitations were sent out quite nicely by high society ladies who offered high tea, followed by a dash of séance. And now, after all, the table was already there, so once you've had your sandwiches, crack on and get the undead involved. And it's quite a simple process by which spirits can communicate with people seated around a table by tilting and rotating it. And slate writing. This is one that we don't see a lot nowadays. Now, this was very popular and very simple to those in the know. Often two slates were tied together or hinged, facing each other. The medium would do their thing, and then by spiritual grace, the separated slates would have writing mysteriously scratched upon them. Of course, this was generally aided by a spare slate or a small piece of chalk underneath the thumbnail. Now, Spirit boards are one of the few elements of spiritualism to really maintain their popularity. Before Ouija boards were patented in 1890, spirit boards, or talking boards, were plentiful. There's even reports of spirit boards of one form or another being used in China in 1100 AD. These boards were all of a similar construct. They were a flat tablet decorated in letters, numbers, or symbols. By the use of a planchette, a pointer, or some kind of variation on a magnifying glass, spirit messages could be communicated upon lucky request. And dark seances, they're not really that sinister, they're literally seances in the dark, because the spirits like it, you know. Now, spirit trumpets are my personal favourite. They were incredibly popular in Seance, but not often replicated in contemporary media. You never see them in a horror film. After all, there really are few sinister qualities to a trumpet. Now, a trumpet isn't a brass instrument as we know it. You know, there was no Yorkshire colliery band smashing through every seance room wall, but these were tapered metal tubes. One end was placed to the medium's ear, the other to that of the sitters, and voices from the afterlife would emerge from the middle, or even a bit of ectoplasm, if you were lucky or unlucky. And next, spirit cabinets. Cabinets were popular with materialisation mediums like the Davenport brothers, pictured in what can only be described as a large wardrobe. These were, materialisation mediums are mediums that believed that kind of rotating their jackets within a wardrobe constituted proof of the afterlife. Spirit cabinets were essentially portable wardrobes in which a medium would sit, often tied to a chair. The door would then be closed, leaving the medium completely shielded from view, and a whole manner of things would emerge. Objects could fly or be thrown, bells could ring, or ghosts could even emerge, as we can see in that other picture. And briefly, materialisations. Ghosts aside, it was commonplace for specialist mediums to manifest enormous amounts of stuff from the ether. This would come from thin air or via a trapdoor, or from the cabinet, or from a large hoop within their skirts. These could appear, a whole manner of things could appear. But the most impressive thing that we know from photography today is our old favourite, ectoplasm. Now, ectoplasm was a manifested spirit energy that would grow from the medium's, let's say, orifice, mainly the mouth. Mainly. Arthur Conan Doyle described ectoplasm as a viscous, gelatinous substance which appeared to differ from every known form of matter in that it could solidify and be used for material purposes. Others describe it as light and flimsy. And of course, you could never see it in daylight because it would dissolve, so darkness was always necessary. Now, in many later photographs, ectoplasm is quite clearly a gauze or a cheesecloth which could be regurgitated quite pleasantly by the medium. In other instances, ectoplasm is made from paper, cloth, egg white, butter muslin, or some tip-top masks in a bit of linen, which are my favourites. But ectoplasm was widespread. One Danish medium, and if anyone's feeling a bit squiffy, maybe just zone out for 10 seconds. One Danish medium was caught hiding ectoplasm in his, let's say, back passage. And Mina Crandon and Helen Duncan would both produce ectoplasmic hands. And Mina's, if we can see in the bottom centre, and quite pleasantly above as well, was really just a piece of carved animal liver. But Helen's was my favourite. It was so DIY. It was a rubber glove on the end of a bit of cheesecloth. It's perfect. But from this growing underworld of mediums came superstars of spiritualism, individuals whose fortunes were made on the back of a whispered secret or a ringing bell. Many of the mediums at the top of their game were women, predominantly upwardly mobile, most very pretty, and some just downright bizarre and terrifying. So let's have a quick look at some of my favourites. I'm going to say Eva Carrière because I did not pass my GCSE French, so I'm taking liberties with that name. Now, Eva isn't technically a Victorian medium. She conducted her first séances in 1905, but she operates broadly within the same tradition, so let's not split hairs. Eva was a French materialisation medium who claimed to have developed mystical powers after the death of her fiancé in 1904. Now, in her 1905 séances, Eva went straight in at the spiritual deep end. She manifested her spirit guide, who was Bien Boa, a 300-year-old Brahmin Hindu, as you do, and Bien appeared in several of Eva's séances. This isn't just conjecture, we know he was there, we have photographic proof. But because we have photographic proof, we also know that in one instance he was a cardboard cutout, and in another instance he was just a bloke in a very unconvincing fake beard, cloak and hat. And a newspaper article in 1906 revealed that this man was actually an Arab coachman called Arexi, who had been hired to play the part of Bien Boa. He reported that he made his appearance into the room via a trapdoor, which was a very, very common trick for materialisation mediums. Because of all the noise that this would make, a lot of seances involved quite loud hymns. So any banging and bashing could quite clearly be covered with devotional songs, shall we say. But Eva remained a really big fan of her handicrafts. For all of her manifestation and ectoplasmic seances, faces could be seen in the mist, as we can see in a few of these, to the right of the slide, very convincing faces that definitely haven't just been Pritt-sticked to her own face. But these were generally, they weren't really lasting to her believers because they were quite quickly identified as current celebrities because their images had been cut out from French newspapers of the time. And the man in the centre is actually King Leopold, who was living at the time, so no idea how she thought she'd get that past people, but good on her. I think we can admire her for that. Arthur Conan Doyle investigated Eva and found her to be completely legitimate. All of these spirits were very much real in the seance room. However, Houdini investigated Eva and found her to be a complete fraud. But this isn't the most memorable aspect of Eva's career. Eva was often referred to as perverse and neurotic. Some of us can relate. She would conduct seances naked, strip and run around the room. She would have sex with her female lover. She would engage in, let's say, sexual activities with certain sitters and audience members at the time. She also frequently closed certain seances, and I do beg your pardon, with the insistence of a full internal exam, just to prove that there was no ectoplasm stashed anywhere it shouldn't be. And that's the sanitised version. So I hope you can see why I like to focus on the little faces. But next, Mrs. Guppy. I love Mrs. Guppy. She was a fascinating and a vicious woman who I'm glad I never met, but I can't stop researching her. She's amazing. She was a fraud and a wonderful and brazen one at that. She could bluff herself out of anything and lied to get her way to the top. From the back streets of Horncastle in Lincolnshire to high society London, her whole existence is a sequence of perfectly crafted lies. Even her birthplace. She's often cited as being born in Richmond. She's about as much of a Londoner as I am. It's not happening. You're from Horncastle, love. It's got some lovely antique shops. Embrace it. Now, no investigator or sceptic ever truly got the better of Mrs. Guppy. She wasn't so foolish as to let a lot of them in. Now, Mrs. Guppy was a pioneer of materialisation. She was a sensation of the London scene. She summoned apports to her seance tables. Now, apports refers to anything that has been brought seemingly by spirits to the seance table. So some mediums would have flowers or quite dainty little things, little gems, smells, things like that. Whereas Mrs. Guppy had clearly got some discount somewhere, and she brought fresh flowers as if they'd come wholesale from the market, whole shrubs, miniature trees with the clods of earth still attached, eels, starfish, lobsters, kittens, puppies, exotic smells, and a mountain of jewels, just for good measure. But as thrilling as a table covered in shrubs and eels is, I'm sure you'll agree, this isn't Mrs. Guppy's most amazing feat. In June 1871, she levitated from her house in Highbury to a séance table in Bloomsbury, literally. This was known as Mrs. Guppy's flight, or Venus in transit, if people were trying to be particularly mocking. Now, reportedly, a séance group held by Hearn and Williams, who were particularly famous male mediums at the time, and they asked the spirit world for an apport, something large, something impressive. Now, someone sat around the table jokingly said, "Let's have Mrs. Guppy," to which another commented, "Good Lord, I hope not. She's the biggest woman in London." But, as recorded in the very clear papers, in an instant somebody called out, "Good God, there's something on my head." Simultaneously, with a heavy bump on the table, came one or two screams. A match was instantly struck, and there, in the middle of the table, was Mrs. Guppy. She was standing in the centre. She had one arm over her eyes, with a pen in her hand and an account book in the other. And we always have to know that the last word she was writing was onions. She was much affected, and when she came round, she began to cry. There was definitely no trapdoor involved in that, but nonetheless, it lit the spiritualist press alight for a long period of time. But in contrast to good old Mrs. Guppy, we have her nemesis, the young, beautiful Florence Cook. Now, Florence, quite disappointingly, didn't dabble in spiritual seafood, but she did have the most famous spirit guide of all time. One of her mediumistic tutors, Frank Hearn, who was one conducting Mrs. Guppy's infamous flight séance, had links with the spirit guide John King, who was a 17th century buccaneer. So naturally, for young Florence, she was going to get to know his daughter. Katie King started emerging in cabinet sessions. At first, she appeared with the glimpse of a face, then as a static body. And before the year was out, the spirit Katie King was wandering around the séance room, fully materialised. However, Katie's glory didn't last too long. At a séance in 1873, Katie was seized by a sitter, a certain sitter who would be future husband of Mrs. Guppy. This was William Volkman. He saw Florence's likeness in Katie, as you might be able to see in the bottom slides, and grabbed her round the waist, grabbed the spirit round the waist, mind. And he absolutely refused to let go, insisting that this was no ghost. After he was pried away, Katie rushed back to the spirit cabinet, and after a while, quite an uncomfortably long time as the men tussled, it was reopened, and Florence, the medium, was found still in her chair in a terrible state. A similar thing also happened in 1880, when the spirit cabinet where the medium was supposed to be seated was thrown open and revealed that Katie was still in the room, but Florence was nowhere to be found. Yet this was controversial, but it wasn't the end of Katie. For many years, the respected scientist William Crookes, whose work went towards developing different types of X-rays, investigated Katie King and Florence and found no reason to believe their partnership as fraudulent. She stayed in his house for quite a long period of time, where the 15-year-old medium manifested Katie King, who would walk around the house, interact with his family, chat with his wife, and even hold a baby. But in Crookes' investigations, he held Katie's hand, he paraded her around the room, and really did see few similarities between the two. After all, Katie was a little shorter and had, I quote, different earlobes. Sadly, many of Crookes' most interesting investigations were destroyed by his family upon his death in a painful attempt to preserve his scientific reputation. However, the remaining photos and articles that we do have speak volumes about Katie King and Florence's legitimacy. Now, when photography was introduced into the séance room, or more specifically into the dark séance room, we were offered a kind of a tantalising glimpse into a dark and gloomy past of spirits, spooks, and of course, ectoplasm. Even if the reality was a little more cheesecloth and wax hand. However, photography was an avenue ripe for spiritual exploration, especially when you took it outside of the séance room. Now, William Mumler's first spirit photograph was a mistake. He was just taking a self-portrait when suddenly the image of his dead cousin appeared behind him. But in no time at all, he figured out how he did it and became a full-time spirit photographer, cashing in on his new magical technique. Now, although these are reposted around the internet again and again in the most creepiest photos ever lists, the reality is a bit more simple and practical. His technique was a variation on a double exposure, meaning that a secondary image behind the primary would appear ghostly and a bit faded out. Now, Mumler did his work alongside his wife, who had made her name as a healing medium. So the two together were kind of the ultimate spiritual package. His wife would do the initial work, getting to know the client and sitter, and then Mumler would use other negatives to make appropriate ghosts appear alongside the living. Mumler's most famous picture shows Mary Todd Lincoln, wife of Abraham Lincoln, with the ghost of her deceased husband. Now, there are different accounts as to how this image came to be. According to one, Mary Todd Lincoln was using the pseudonym Mrs. Tundle when she had her picture taken, and Mumler had absolutely no idea who she was, despite her being one of the most famous women in America. But another theme or variation around her story was that Mrs. Lincoln arrived using the name Mrs. Lindell, and Mumler's wife encouraged her to identify her husband's figure within the photo. And that image in particular continues to be widely circulated and celebrated as legitimate, despite being very publicly recognised as a fake for well over a century now. However, in the UK, the first spirit photographer was Frederick Hudson, whose work I really do prefer. It's a lot more Blue Peter. So with him, instead of dressing up secondary photos, he dressed up himself and had a lot of props, a lot of far more questionable ghosts in the background of his own photos. And I think they were used to quite remarkable effect. But with such an enormous and rich culture springing up around spiritualism, why on earth did it peter out, at least in terms of these amazing claims? In short, exposures, investigations, and wising up to the legitimacy of Martian kings, the exposure of fraudulent ectoplasm, as well, in particular, caused an enormous decline in the popularity of physical mediumship. It carried on, but it simplified as we know it today, into small study groups and individual mediums who only focused on verbal contact and messages. Most mediums working today will only offer one-on-one sessions, with group sittings the realm of paranormal investigative groups. And the Spiritualist Church today is as much concerned with mindfulness as it is with the realm of actual spirits. And yet somehow, through all of this, we get to Derek Acora. I understand papier-mâché ghosts. I understand spirit trumpets. I love spirit trumpets. And I certainly understand that familiar scene of hiding ectoplasm in your gusset. Heck, we've all done it. Or we certainly will later today. But just how we got from the Fox sisters to the shrieking excitement of perma-tanned celebrity mediums is a mystery that I'll leave you to solve. I just know that it's been a hell of a journey. Thank you very much.